Hi! I just wanted to take a moment to read a list of names here. Jackie, Vihan, Reagan, and Sadie were your anchors this year. Hunter, Elliot, and Joseph were your cameramen. We have Olivia and Jack with weather. Alex and Jaron did the sports. Kendall, Ava, Zoe, and Victoria were your interviewers. Subhan and Pratham did jokes and quotes. Hannah was on Twitter. Serena, Liliana, and Luciana were on standby in case we needed anybody. I just want to say thank you to these guys. You did a fantastic job. You guys don't know how much work they put in. People gave up their lunches. People gave up their recesses. We have kids coming in here at 7:30 in the morning on their off time just to record. I am so proud of you guys. You made the morning news so good. Maybe you made a couple people smile. Maybe you made a couple people stop from yawning in the morning. I just want to thank you for your hard work. And yeah, best of luck at middle school, guys.
Good morning, Dolphins. I'm Jacqueline.
I'm Olivia.
And I'm Hannah.
I'm Kendall.
I'm Vihan.
I'm Sadie.
I'm Gabriel.
I'm Jared.
I'm Liliana.
And I'm Pratham.
And I'm Jaron.
And I'm Dakota.
And I'm Jack.
And I'm Hunter.
And I'm Alex.
And I'm Reagan. We are the 2022 to 2023 DDN Thurs. Welcome to DDN. Today's Thursday, June. Wait, never mind. It's just the last day of school. Let's begin with our morning pledge. Everyone please stand.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you for joining us in the pledge. I'm positive everyone sounded terrific.
Today, we celebrate two birthdays. Happy birthday to Vivian from Mrs. Skelman's class and Mia from Mrs. Fiorella's class. Happy birthday!
Now, let's take our last look at the weather with Olivia.
Good morning, everyone. Today there's a high of 73 and a low of 61 with 50% chance of rain. Tonight there's a low of 61 with clear skies. That's a wrap for DDN weather. See you all next year, or not.
Hello Dolphins, Dr. Straddick here with the last Straddick Spotlight of the year. I wanted to take a second just to talk about what an amazing year we've had. We've had some awesome field trips, incredible celebrations, including being the first school in Marlborough's history to win a National Blue Ribbon Award. What an awesome way to start the year. And everybody, your teachers, all of you, played a really important role in us accomplishing that goal that very, very few schools ever achieve. Only 9 in all of New Jersey accomplished that this year, and 300 in the entire country. So give yourself a pat on the back. That's an amazing thing, and you will always have that in your history, that you were in a blue ribbon school, and that is a really, really cool thing. As you get ready for summer, we want you to have a relaxing, fun-filled summer where you get to play with friends. We hope you're going to take some time to read a little bit, maybe practice your skills in math by Excel, or just practicing your fact fluency. But get out there and have fun with your friends and your family. Take some time to relax and enjoy the sunshine. And we will be here in the fall to welcome you back with smiles, and we're excited about that. For those of you 5th graders that are moving on to middle school, I want to thank you for everything during your time here at DeFino. You started in kindergarten. You've been here for 6 years, which is pretty amazing. A lot of you have been here for 6 years. And as you go on to middle school, we are behind you. We believe in you. We know you'll continue to do great things. Please take care of each other. Remember to be kind, be respectful, be those good citizens that we know you can be. Enjoy the rest of this year and the celebrations that are still to come. And always remember, fins up, Dolphins.
That's all for DDN. Have a tremendous Thursday and a spectacular summer. Remember, fins up, Dolphins!
Fins up, Dolphins!
My sister foot.
Fins up, Dolphins.
Farewell, Dolphins!
Curious.
This just in, your summer birthdays. Sorry, hosts, I have to do this one by myself. So for the month of June, after Thursday, the last day of school, we have Josie from Mrs. Lloyd's class, Humphrey from Mrs. DiVirgilio and Mrs. Belez's class, Tyson from Mr. LaGuardia's class, Shloka and Pratham from Mrs. Glassberg's class, Arjun from Miss Steets, Vivan from Mr. Hatter, Aruba from Mrs. Shagru's class, and Navia and Samara from Mrs. Gelman's class. Also, it's Mrs. Markarian's birthday, too, our very own. July birthdays. Anna and Sharini from Miss Fahey's class. Shahara from Mr. Galardia's class. Natalie from Mrs. Shagru's class. Kingsley from Mrs. Teleposki. Cameron from Mrs. Montalbano and Mrs. Baker's class. James from Mrs. Syed. Ariella, Sabrina, Farid from Mrs. Bartlett's class. Abigail from Miss Steets. Anthony from Mrs. Hill. Vedanth, Olivia, and Zachary from Mrs. Gershman and Mrs. Dillon's class. Margot from Mrs. Morris's class. Kaya, Josh, Kayla, Arshan from Mrs. Lloyd's class. Adia from Mr. Hatter's class. Dylan, Haley, and Andriana from Mrs. DiVirgilio and Mrs. Belez's class. Evan, Ava, and Vienna from Mrs. Bonarigo's class. Indra and Hannah from Miss Fiorello's class. Ava, Nathan, Jeremiah, Eva from Mrs. Brown and Miss Bruno's class. Taig, Liliana, David, and Victoria from Mrs. Yano and Mrs. Saldudi's class. Sama from Mrs. Fischetti. Josh, Ariella, and Jack from Mrs. Bayer. Christian from Mrs. Winter. Stella, Zoe, and Shayna from Mrs. Harris's class. Esther, Reed, and Mia from Mrs. McGordy's class. Rayan and Ion from Mrs. Gelman's class. Brielle and Neil from Mrs. Morris's class. And Isabel, Leah, and Aiden from Mrs. Trez's class. And let's not forget Mrs. Vecchio, Mrs. Levin, Mrs. Bayer, Mr. LaGuardia, Mrs. Morris, Mrs. Teleposki, Mrs. Treza. All your July birthdays. August birthdays. For your August birthdays, we have Obi from Mrs. Lloyd's class, Jackie from Mrs. Bayer's class, Giovanna from Mrs. Morris, Harsamar from Mrs. Brown and Miss Bruno's class, Zachary from Mrs. Glassberg's class, Nicholas from Mrs. Bichetti, Abigail from Mrs. McGordy, Joseph from Mrs. Trez's class. We've got Corbin, Jacob, Rohit, Max, Iris, all from Mrs. Shagru's class. A lot of birthdays in August in there. We got Rashab, Melanie, and Ben from Mrs. Bonarigo's class, Manya from Miss Steets' class, Sam, Dallas, Zane from Mr. LaGuardia's class. We've got Vishnu and Brianna from Mrs. Teleposki. We have Michael, Andre, Joyce, Iris, Aria from Mrs. Montalbano and Mrs. Baker's class. Avi from Mrs. Fiorella's class. Leo, Zenzi, Nolian, and Adam from Mrs. Gershman and Mrs. Dillon's class. Aiden and Natalie from Mrs.Fichetti's class. Christopher, Yas, and Riddick from Mrs. Bartlett's class. Mita from Mrs. DiVirgilio and Mrs. Belez's class. Priya and Adriana from Mr. Hatter's class. Thasme and Nicholas from Mrs. Gelman's class. Aman, Sophia, Laura, and Valentina Castro.
No, don't say Castro.
That's
What'd I just say?
From Mrs. Harris's class, Alexandra and Alexandra from Mrs. Yano and Mrs. Saladudi's class. You girls know who you are. And also, let's not forget, Mrs. Foreman, Mrs. Treza, Mrs. Iftikhar, Mrs. O'Connor, Mr. Potts, Mrs. McLaughlin, Miss Bruno, Miss Quackenbush, Mrs. Rousseau, all happy birthdays to you.